Zombies, environmental declensionism, and the fate of humanity. Symbolism in the zombie metaphor, 1968 to 2013. A presentation delivered by Andrew Watson at the American Society for Environmental History annual conference held in Toronto in April 2013. Zombies are kind of a big deal these days. From movies and video games, novels and comics, and even TV shows, zombies have come to occupy a prominent spot in pop culture. But this popularity has also seen zombies spill out into other aspects of everyday life. For example, when asked during question period in the House of Commons in February 2013 what the government was doing to prevent a zombie apocalypse, Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister John Baird assured the House and all Canadians that he and the government were dedicated, he actually said dedicated, to ensuring Canada never became a safe haven for zombies, a sort of reference to maintaining secure borders. And there are lots of other examples of how popular zombies have become lately, but the point here is that clearly zombies have come to occupy a prominent spot in our popular consciousness. But what are zombies? There are two kinds of zombies, really. The older of the two is the voodoo zombie, which originates out of the Haitian Caribbean setting during the 18th and 19th centuries, and eventually finds its way into American pop culture during the early part of the 20th century. A voodoo zombie is basically someone who has had a spell or curse cast on them by a witch doctor or a sorcerer, which turns the victim into a kind of mindless slave who loses control over their body and does things they wouldn't otherwise do at the behest of the sorcerer or person who casts a spell on them. Perhaps the best example of the voodoo zombie in American pop culture is the movie White Zombie, released in 1932. In this film, a white couple travels to Haiti on an exotic adventure, and the female lead ends up getting a spell cast on her, turning her into a white zombie. She loses control of her body and ends up in rather sexually or racially compromising situations for which American audiences during the 1930s would have found shocking. Fast forward a few decades into the 1950s and 1960s, and we see early iterations of a more modern zombie, which fully crystallizes in George A. Romero's 1968 film, Night of the Living Dead. While Romero's modern zombie shares many parallels with the voodoo zombie, the modern zombie comes to replace the voodoo zombie. In fact, almost all zombies in pop culture since 1968 have been modeled off Romero's zombies in one way or another. Modern zombies are people that have died from a virus or plague and have reanimated as walking corpses, intent on feeding on the flesh of the living. Whereas voodoo zombies are often living people, modern zombies are very much monsters and a threat to people. Moreover, while voodoo zombies are really a temporary individual problem, the modern zombie is a permanent societal problem, since what has turned people into zombies cannot be reversed. There's a typical narrative arc which all modern zombie movies follow, which is that a mysterious virus or plague emerges, which spreads communicably from person to person through a bite. Anyone bitten by a zombie will eventually die from the virus and reanimate as a zombie, who then proceeds to bite others. The virus spreads so quickly in this way that it overwhelms the capacity for the state, the military, or doctors to contain it, which eventually leads to the vast majority of the population becoming zombies, and eventually the collapse of society and civilization. But of course, a small number of strangers must survive and try to keep going in this post-apocalyptic world. And this is an important point, that the zombie genre is really just a subset of a larger post-apocalyptic genre of stories, whether inspired by political conflict like nuclear war, or social and cultural change like protests or race riots, or economic decline like the case of Detroit during the late 20th century. Post-apocalyptic stories reflect political, social, and economic anxieties of the times. But I would like to suggest that these kinds of stories, and the zombie genre in particular, also contain a certain strain of environmental anxiety, which I'd like to explore a little bit more here. Perhaps the best way to contextualize and historicize the connection between the popularity of zombies and the influence of environmental anxiety in the genre is to trace the growth in the number of movies produced between 1950 and the present, and correlate that growth with important moments or trends related to concerns about the environment in North America. The first period that you can see here runs through the 1950s and into the 60s. This was a period of intense nuclear testing. As you can see in the bottom graph, in the late 50s and early 60s there is a dramatic spike in the number of nuclear tests conducted, particularly by the United States. To some extent this informs the first modern zombie movie, Romero's Night of the Living Dead in 1968. In the film, a group of survivors find refuge in an abandoned farmhouse with zombies surrounding them trying to get in to eat their flesh. During the film, we discover that the cause of the plague is radiation from a space probe returning from outer space. Thus we can see that Night of the Living Dead was inspired at least somewhat by concerns about nuclear fallout and radiation. However, as the Museum of Modern Art pointed out in a 2007 exhibit on the film, the movie was not so much about environmental anxiety related to nuclear radiation, although that certainly played a part, but was much more a response to social and political anxieties during that decade in which loss of life from things like Vietnam and the assassination of President Kennedy were seen to be without purpose and meaning. Environmental anxiety really starts to occupy a much more prominent place in subsequent zombie films, however. Into the 1970s, there is a rise in the number of zombie movies, possibly as a result of the popularity of Romero's Night of the Living Dead. But this is also a period that witnesses the rise of environmentalism. During this time, we see the first concerns about overpopulation and exhaustion of the world's resources. Americans become critical of overconsumption and consumerism more generally. In 1972, Limits to Growth is published, and the following year, in 1973, is the first oil crisis. And these kinds of factors inform the production of Romero's second zombie film, Dawn of the Dead, in 1978. In the film, a group of survivors hole up in a suburban mall with zombies surrounding it trying to get in and eat the flesh of the people inside. This film does a wonderful job of juxtaposing the desire on the part of the zombies to get inside and consume human flesh with the seeming pointlessness of post-war American consumerism. Since nearly everyone has turned into zombies, all the goods and products in the mall stores have become essentially finite, since there is no one left to make any more. And the very context within which purchasing and consuming those goods and products matters has been eliminated because there isn't anyone left alive to provide meaning to the act of consumerism. Into the 1980s, there's a steady growth in the number of zombie movies produced each year. Again, this is likely a response to the popularity of Dawn of the Dead, but it can also be seen in the context of the emergence of AIDS after 1981. In many of the zombie movies during this period, zombies are depicted in much more biological ways, kind of like walking disease. Human anatomy is featured more prominently, with scenes showing the insides of zombies and a lot more gore. In Romero's third zombie film, Day of the Dead, in 1985, a group of strangers are trapped in an underground bunker trying to help a scientist discover a cure or a way of reversing the plague. This focus on a cure or a way of reversing the plague is new to the zombie genre, and together with overt displays of zombies as biological and walking disease, seems to reflect America's growing anxieties about incurable disease in the wake of AIDS. Into the 1990s, the number of zombie movies produced stagnates or declines. This is probably a response to the end of the Cold War and associated reduction in social and political anxieties in connection with that. But after 9/11, there is a huge spike in the number of zombie movies made, In many ways, this massive increase is a response to heightened anxieties about social order and questions about the merits of Western civilization in general. But the emergence of SARS in 2003, followed by concerns about the avian and swine flu outbreaks in the years that followed, also inspired a renewed focus on disease in zombie films during the 21st century. However, what I think is distinctive about the popularity of zombie movies in the 21st century is the way urban environments are featured. In 2007, for example, the UN released a report showing that half the world's population now lived in urban areas. In many ways, 21st century zombie movies convey a growing anxiety about urban environments, with movies like 28 Days Later in 2002, the comic book The Walking Dead in 2003, which has later been turned into a TV show, the remake of Dawn of the Dead in 2004, and the novel World War Z in 2006, which will be made into a movie in June 2013. All of these films and stories feature urban environments very prominently. In 28 Days Later, the main character wakes up in a hospital in London to find the city completely abandoned. The opening scenes of this film are terrifying not because of zombies, they don't show up until a little bit later in the film, but because this enormous metropolis has no people in it. Cities are supposed to have people in them, and empty streets are a scary prospect for anyone who knows inner city environments. Similarly, the comic book and TV show The Walking Dead both have opening scenes that feature the main character entering an abandoned city on his own. In the upper image from the TV show, you can also see a stream of cars attempting to flee the downtown core. Presumably their occupants have been attacked and turned into zombies in the process, but this illustrates a kind of anxiety about wanting to get out of the city. But perhaps the most striking example of the anxiety of urban environments represented in 21st century zombie films comes in the opening scenes of the remake of Dawn of the Dead in 2004, in which the main character attempts to flee the safe haven of the suburbs, which have been overrun by zombies and consequently transformed into a death trap. As we can see then, 21st century zombie movies have come to feature anxiety about urban environments quite prominently. Fears about overpopulation, collapse of the inner core, and as we saw with the case of Dawn of the Dead, turning the image of the suburban ideal on its head by equating zombies with chaos.